and welcome. Joining me today to share the stories behind his 10 best spiritual books is Chief Economist, Shaman, activist and best-selling author John Perkins, who's the founder and board member of the non-profit organisations, the Pachamama Alliance and Dream Change Coalition. A leading expert on the lessons Indigenous cultures can teach us, John Perkins has written 10 books on global intrigue and economics, geopolitics, and Indigenous cultures, including Touching the Jaguar, Shapeshifting, and the classic Confessions of an Economic Hitman. John Perkins, welcome.
Thank you, Sandie. It's wonderful to be with you.
Thank you for joining us, John. Now, you've been initiated as a shaman in Amazonian and Andean Indigenous cultures. You've lectured at Harvard, Oxford, and more than 50 universities, as well as economic forums and shamanic gatherings around the world. You have had two incredibly diverse paths in your life, and yet you've woven them brilliantly together. That makes me very curious to learn more about the books that influenced you and inspired your extraordinary journey.
Yeah, it has been an extraordinary journey. You know, it's interesting when I speak at big economic conferences or corporate conferences, somebody's bound to raise their hand or come up to me afterwards and say, "You're not that woo guy who wrote those books on shamanism, are you?" When I speak at shamanic culture conferences or spiritual gatherings like that, people will say, you're not that bad guy who wrote the Confessions of an Economic Hitman, are you? So the book Touching the Jaguar, which I'm wearing this jaguar now, my most recent book was an attempt to bring those two together. And I think actually spiritually, in many ways, those two fields are very, very connected.
Yes, absolutely they are. And one thing I noticed about your list is that I would pretty much say a lot of the books on it are books that deal with these kinds of clashes that people meet in life. There seems to be an oppressor and somebody is working against that to find themselves in the process. What attracts you to these kinds of books?
Well, I think, one of the books that I listed is Graham Greene's The Power and the Glory. And that had a huge influence on me. Graham Greene had a huge influence on me back when I was an economic hitman. Officially, I was chief economist at a big consulting firm. But I was traveling around the world, basically exploiting countries. I believe that what I was doing was good for the countries at the beginning, because that's what's taught in business school and by the World Bank, et cetera. Mm-hmm. But over time, I began to see that was false, that we were lying to ourselves and to these other countries, that we were really helping were very rich people in their countries and in our own country, in big corporations. And Graham Greene dealt with these kinds of problems in many of his books. And The Power and the Glory is one in which is a Catholic priest who is in Mexico during the Mexican Revolution. And he's faced with this terrible dilemma that if he goes in and practices his vocation as a priest in communities, and certain people find out about this part of the revolution, they'll go in and kill people in that community. And so the question is, should he forsake his spiritual beliefs, his religion, or should he continue to do it, and knowing full well that it may end up getting people killed? So it's this conscience, this struggle with his conscience. And I was going through something very similar at the time I read that book and several of his books back in the 1970s. And that kind of got me started on this path of really looking into myself and not necessarily relying on what I'd learned in college courses or what the World Bank had to say or the International Monetary Fund or any of those other organizations.
Wow. Yeah. So what year was that? When were you reading that book?
Well, probably 75, 76, mid-70s.
So did that start the snowball rolling?
Yes. I think the snowball that started rolling, one of my clients was Omar Torrijos, who was the head of state of Panama. And he wasn't buying the stuff I was trying to sell him. He was one of the very few. There were only two, in my career, there were only two presidents who did not buy into the deals I was offering. And in not buying in, they knew that their lives were at risk, because the United States says, we've admitted that when people that don't buy into these deals that I describe in Confessions of an Economic Hitman, when countries' presidents don't join us in these deals in the countries that we really want to bring around, they tend to get overthrown or even assassinated. And the United States, we've admitted that we played a huge role in bringing around the demise of Salvador Allende, of Chile, of Arbenz, of Guatemala, of Lumumba, of the Congo, of Vietnam, of Mossadegh in Iran, and so on. And Omar was very aware of that, and yet he totally resisted. He had tremendous integrity, and I speak Spanish fluently, and I developed a relationship with him, and he began to tell me, he said, John, don't you really see what it is you're really doing in these countries? Come on, you got to understand this. And in fact, I was reading The Power and the Glory and a couple of other Graham Greene books while I was in Panama working with Omar. And during one of those trips, I actually got to meet Graham Greene. He was there writing a book called Conversations with the General, which was Conversations with Torrijos. And we quite serendipitously met in the lobby in the coffee shop of the Hotel Panama in Panama City. It was quite an amazing experience for me.
And did you talk to him about this dilemma that you were facing?
I did, and what happened is sort of interesting. So I'm reading Time magazine. I'm sitting in the lobby of the hotel. I've just finished breakfast. And I'm sitting in the lobby just looking through Time magazine, and I see a picture of Omar Torrijos and Graham Greene in the people section. And just as I'm looking at this picture, this man walks through the lobby, and it's obviously Graham Greene. And he goes into the coffee shop. So I go into the coffee shop, and I was living in this hotel, and I knew the maitre d' very well. I was a pretty good tipper, and I'm friendly with people. I speak Spanish. And so I said to him, hey, I want to sit at that table next. He said, well, you just had breakfast. And I said, yeah, but I'm going to have another one. Put me next to that table. So he did, and I sit there. I was rather embarrassed, but eventually I'm facing this way, and Graham Greene is at the next table facing this way. So we're kind of facing each other. And I said, excuse me, I don't mean to be obnoxious, but you are my favorite author, aren't you, Graham Greene? Why, yes, he said. Well, why don't you join me?
Oh, wow.
Table. And we had quite a conversation. And I told him how I wanted to be a writer like him someday. And, it was very, very interesting that he pointed out to me that fiction, he said, he's now writing a book called Conversations with the General, nonfiction, but most everything he wrote was fiction. And he said, the problem with nonfiction is you've got to stick very much to the facts. And sometimes the facts aren't really the truth. The facts don't really define the truth. You can get to the truth much more easily in nonfiction. And you may have noticed, Sandie, although I write nonfiction, every one of those books, I believe every one of those books on the list I sent you is fiction. I don't really enjoy reading. I read a lot of nonfiction because I have to keep up with things to do my own writing. But my pleasure comes from nonfiction because I do think it's a way of expressing a truth that goes deeper than the objective facts that we can do with nonfiction, even though nonfiction also is important. And it's why when I write nonfiction, I write what's called creative narrative or nonfiction narrative, whatever it's called. But I write like in stories. And so I try to write it so that it's fun to read and you can kind of delve into the thoughts and the feelings of the people behind the facts.
Yeah, and you can. I mean, they're very compelling books. As I said before we started this interview, I was up at 5 o'clock this morning because I've been reading one of them and I couldn't put it down. On your list, you also have Macbeth. That one surprised me.
Well, I think Macbeth is the quintessential economic hit person. He and Lady Macbeth combined.
Yes.
And they're struggling with this whole thing. And the idea is, how do you overthrow a king? And in the end, you have to. They conclude that you had to assassinate the king. And it was a huge, consciousness searching thing. And this image of Lady Macbeth rubbing her hands and saying that she can't get the blood off her hands like this. That's wow. I went through that. I didn't actually ever kill anybody. But I knew that if presidents and their administrations didn't accept my ideals, there were people right behind me called the jackals that would overthrow presidents or assassinate them. And the man I just referred to, Omar Torrijos, the head of state of Panama, was killed in a very suspicious private plane crash soon after he signed the Panama Canal Treaty with Jimmy Carter. Most people believe that it was an assassination. And it also followed on the only other client I had that didn't play the game, and that was Jaime Roldos of Ecuador, who died almost exactly the same way in a private plane crash less than 3 months before Omaha. So, you know, I didn't have blood on my hands, so to speak, but I could really relate to these characters who were, I went through something very similar at some point, saying, you know, well, why on earth did I ever get involved in this horrible world that I was involved in? And that's why I decided to spend the rest of my life trying to change it.
Yeah, puts you in a very invidious position where you've got to take the road of the lesser of two evils, but it's still an evil.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, you know, it's very clever the way our societies portray these things, because in business school, I'd been taught that what I was doing was the right thing. You know, you convince countries to take huge loans and invest in big infrastructure projects, hire our companies that make big profits to build infrastructure projects, and it shows that the economy increases. And it does. You can show that statistically if you use GDP as a measure, gross domestic product. But what I came to understand is that gross domestic product only really measures the very rich. It doesn't measure overall prosperity. But it took a long time for me to understand that. And once I did, it was very tough to get out. It was tremendous pressure put on me not to get out. Plus, I grew up son of a relatively poor teacher in rural New Hampshire. I'd always dreamed of traveling around the world, making lots of money, flying first class, staying in the best hotels, wining and dining with presidents. And now I'm doing all that. And so the temptation not to believe the truth, as I was beginning to know the truth, hounded me. And that's a theme that runs through so many of these books that I put on my list, whether we've mentioned the Graham Greene books, and also Macbeth, and you look at Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. These books deal with that struggle. And I suspect that every one of your listeners has some aspect of that struggle. Am I driving my car a little too much? I know I shouldn't use quite so much fuel. Should I really fly on an airplane to take this next vacation? I mean, I love to eat meat, but I know I ought to be a vegetarian. There's all these things, we constantly go through. I think we all can relate to these, and some of us have it on a bigger level than others. And I had it at one point in my life on a very big level.
Yeah, it really does. The world is forcing us to examine, our ethics and our integrity. I see this all the time. I mean, companies like Amazon rule the world now. And, my daughter-in-law says, I'm banning Amazon. I don't like anything about them. Let's go and support the local businesses. And then my son says, yeah, but it's quick, and I want it today. And so this dialogue, and it's the same. We have that internal dialogue all the time.
We do. And the book I'm working on right now, which I have a deadline in a couple of weeks, actually, to get the draft. It's supposed to come out in October. It will come out in October. It deals with the economic hitment of China and how they've learned from our successes and our failures, and they're doing a much better job than we are at taking over so much of the world. And as I write this book, I'm very cognizant of the fact that the Chinese have done a lot of very bad things. They've also done some very good things. They brought over 700 million people out of extreme poverty, which is more than the rest of the world combined. They've had incredible economic growth. They've pulled themselves out of a terrible Mao era of incredible repression and terrible poverty. And they've also done a lot of bad things. But if I talk about the good things, and I've done this on podcasts and so on, working into this book, I often get a very strong knee-jerk reaction from Americans, especially, saying, "Oh, how can you say anything good about the Chinese?" And and then I talk to Chinese people, and they have a very, very different aspect. And it's interesting to me that none of the ones I've talked with paint us in a bad picture. They're concerned that we don't understand them.
Yeah.
But it's so interesting to see how we have these very, very strong feelings that are hard to overcome, and most of them are based on on some aspect of facts, but then there's always a slant that's put on that. You know, we're all conned to a certain degree, and we in the United States are very conned to thinking that the Chinese can do very little that's good, that we ought to be very suspicious of them. And in fact, what we've got to understand is that they have a population that's the same as ours, plus 1,100,000,000 people. And their economy is going to overtake ours very soon, and already has in most of the world. And that if we don't try somehow to come together, these two countries, to change what economists are increasingly call a death economy, an economic system that's basically consuming itself into extinction. If China and the United States and Europe and but much of the rest of the world don't come together to understand that we can disagree on lots of things, but we must agree that we're going to end this insanity of short-term maximization of profits and materialistic consumption. We've got to come together to change that.
Absolutely, we do. Absolutely. Is there anything more you want to say about Shakespeare and Macbeth?
Well, so much of Shakespeare struggles with these very, very issues. You know,
perennial, aren't they?
Yes.
Yes, we never learn.
And sometimes he does it through romance, as in Romeo and Juliet, and the struggle between, well, I love this man, I love this woman, but they're my enemies. Their families are my family's enemies. What do I do about that? You know, I mean, what a classic struggle that is. And, you know, again, probably a lot of us went through that. You know, I was born in a little rural New Hampshire town where there was a clash between the Protestants and which were mainly Calvinists, Methodists, and Congregationalists against the Catholics. And you know, I was brought up, you don't date a Catholic girl, and they were brought up, you don't date a congregational man. And and I ended up dating one, falling in love with this Catholic girl, and it was like, oh my God, you know. And so we go through these very human in romance, and of course Shakespeare also deals with the comedies, and he deals with it in the tragedies like Macbeth and Hamlet and others. So yeah, it's amazing when you think back to this man in the 1600s, or whoever he was,
and can articulate all of it.
That wrote these incredible analyses of human character that are still with us, that are still so relevant.
So was it the whole story that inspired you, or was it Macbeth himself?
Well, certainly Lady Macbeth and Macbeth. It was a whole story, you know, and the king, you know, that was killed. He was the same sort of person, and it was that whole setup. Yes, and I think that's also part of the overall story, that it's never really about one person. It's about one person within a system.
Yeah.
And Macbeth and Lady Macbeth were caught in this system of believing that you had to attain the power. You needed to become king because it was the best thing for everybody, really. And you had to do whatever it took to become king.
Isn't that what's happening in Russia now? Doesn't he want to be king?
Yes, of course. Yeah.
What is it with human nature? You know, we always think we've got to have that power. Why do we think that power is so valuable?
Yeah, I think it's the alpha male complex, and it can be the alpha female complex. It can go that way. Sometimes we forget that female animals can be extremely aggressive too, and protective of the territory, and even want to expand the territory. But it's particularly strong, I think, among males. I think testosterone drives that. You know, you think about the caveman standing at the edge of the cave, and his woman and his kids are behind him in the cave, and the saber-toothed tiger's coming to attack, and he comes out there with his spear to fend off the saber-toothed tiger. Now you wonder, well, why didn't that guy just leave? He could have crept around behind the cave and found another woman someplace, but the testosterone kicked in. And we hope it kicked in. And he defended his family against the saber-toothed tiger or the other enemy, whatever. And certainly that testosterone drive is a very strong one in human males. And I think it's something that we today are trying hard. I think throughout history, people have tried hard at various times to overcome that. It's a tough one to overcome.
It is.
And then there's businesses that thrive off of it. So let's not forget, as we talk about Putin, that also the United States military complex is thriving off this. It's an election year, and Biden to some people looked kind of wimpish when he pulled out of Afghanistan and the way he did it. So this is not necessarily serving against his interests, and I'm not doing anything to excuse what Putin has done. It's outlandish. It's horrible what he's done, but all of these factors come into play on both sides, and we have this long history.
Yeah, everybody's doing it.
Yeah,
and war is wealth, isn't it?
But I think, Sandie, that herein lies the possible solution to the biggest problem that's facing us. And let's admit that all of these issues are somewhat small compared to the bigger issue, which is that we're destroying life on this planet as we know it. Life will survive, I'm convinced. The cockroaches or the octopuses or something, they'll survive. But we're destroying life as we know it, and that's the big issue. And we're being distracted by all these other issues, including COVID, including race issues, and they're all important. I'm not saying they're not important, but they're distractions. And I often think, if there was a UFO hovering above us, if we were being threatened by aliens, what would we do? Wouldn't we come together? I think there's a very good chance the Chinese, the Russians, Brazilians, the Indians, the British, everybody, we'd all come together. So I believe it's time to admit that we are the aliens. We have defined ourselves as apart from rather than a part of nature. And that's the difference between us and the indigenous people that I've lived with in the Amazon, for example. They see themselves as a part of nature.
Yes.
And I think throughout our 250,000 plus years of human history, most of that time we've looked at ourselves as a part of nature, not dominant over, not human supremacy. It's only been within the last several thousand years, which is a blink in the eye of history, that we've seen ourselves as apart from. And when we see ourselves as apart from nature, we define ourselves as aliens. We are aliens on our own planet. And it isn't human beings. It isn't us. It's our attitude. It's our perception that to be successful, we need to dominate nature. We need to maximize short-term materialistic gain. And so if we can just see that we are these aliens, and we and China and Russia and India and Brazil and the United Kingdom and all of our countries we can disagree on a lot of things. We can disagree on Tibet. We can disagree on the U.S., what the U.S. is doing in Afghanistan or Iraq. We can disagree on Brexit. We can disagree on lots of things. But let's agree that we're going to stop defining ourselves as aliens. Let's agree that we're going to create a socioeconomic philosophy that says that to be successful humans, we have to create systems that benefit all life on this planet in the long run. Yeah. And let that be the defining factor behind businesses. Let's create businesses that pay people to clean up pollution. It's quite simple, actually. Create a life economy, an economic system that cleans up pollution, that regenerates destroyed environments, that recycles, and that creates technologies that don't ravage the earth. If we can define ourselves as living within that context of being a part of nature and attack the alien idea that we're apart from, then we can start moving in the right direction. And that's my hope through all this. And that I think is this. That's the struggle. That's the Shakespearean struggle that we're all going through.
Absolutely. Yeah. I want to come back to that once we've finished talking about your books, John, because there's so much more to say there. Let's talk about The Alchemist, Paulo Coelho, 1988. That was published. It consistently turns up on people's 10 best lists. What was it about this book that inspired you so much?
Well, it's about the magic of transformation, but it's brilliantly written. You know, it's a beautifully written book, and it's very short, which is nice. People can pick it up and read it fairly quickly. And Coelho he just, you know, he grabs your heart. And of course, that's the hallmark of all great writing. Shakespeare does the same thing, and Graham Greene does the same thing, and Conrad does that. But he did in a short book, he really grabs your heart and opens you to the possibility of magic. There's magic. And we all know there's magic. We all believe in magic on a certain level. And there's no greater magic than art and writing. And, you know, for me, all of these books that are on the list, I think all of them, always inspired me to want to go deeper into writing. It was a long time when I gave up on writing. I was badly hurt by a English professor back years ago, and I just decided not to write anymore. But then I began to read things like these books that are on this list, and including The Alchemist, and could see the magic in it, and how the pen indeed is mightier than the sword if we just allow it to be, if we use it properly.
Yeah, I mean, stories are amazing, you know.
Yes,
we exist on stories, and that's always been the case. Yeah, it's also one of those, for me, it's one of those books that it's very simple, you know, and the more simple it is, the better, because it cuts through, you know, all of the crap. Here's the point.
Right. And, you know, I think, so the idea of touching the jaguar is an idea that came to me from a shaman in the Amazon many years ago when I was a Peace Corps volunteer there in 1969. And he said, you know, we have to, if there's something blocking us, we can see it as a jaguar standing on our path. And it's a visionary jaguar. It's not a real jaguar. So if we run from it, it'll chase us. But if we touch it, it'll help us change our perception. And when we change our perception, we change our value system. When we change our values, we change our actions. When we change our actions, we change reality. So the secret to changing reality is to change perception. And that's why right now, if we can change from this idea of maximizing short-term consumption and profits, material profits, to long-term benefits, that's a change of perception. But it changes our actions. If we realize that, you know, there is no England, there's no Canada, there's no United States, there's no corporations, there's no religion except as we perceive them. And when enough people accept a perception or codify it into law, it has a huge impact on reality. And I think that's part of all these books on this list, and it's certainly part of The Alchemist, is that by changing perceptions through art, primarily that's one of the ways of doing it, and through changing perceptions, we change reality. That's a powerful thought, and it does help you realize that art is a lot more powerful ultimately than military might.
Indeed,
because military might may force people to do certain things, but it doesn't really get them to change necessarily.
No. I don't think you can change until you're touched deeply by something.
Yes.
Then it kind of hits in the muscle, and then change occurs.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So let's talk about Grendel by John Gardner. That book was published in 1989. When did it come into your life? Do you recall?
Probably shortly after that. I don't recall exactly. Early 90s must have been. And that was the time that I was going through quite a transition. And what I, took about that book, so it plays off the story of Beowulf, which is also on the list.
On the list, yeah.
and I was always taken by Beowulf. The fact that Beowulf has to confront and fight the monster, but he has to do it alone. He says he has to go down into this dark pit and kill the monster. He can't take any of his comrades with him. He has to do it alone. He has to do it on his own, and ultimately he has a special sword that he uses, which actually is a special perception. That's how I read it. And I love the fact that Grendel, then John Gardner, in writing Grendel, he saw very clearly that once you kill the monster, you have to kill the mother of the monster. And I think that's such an important statement, because once we understand what it is that's holding us back, once we've touching the jaguar, what's holding us back, then we really have to go a little deeper and say, well, what caused that? What's the mother of that feeling? So, for example, I understood at some point that I was not touching the jaguar, that I always wanted to be a writer, but I'd given up. I didn't dare. I wrote a lot of reports as a chief economist. I was great. That was one of the reasons I was successful, because I could write well. I could convince people through my writing, but these were not personal. But I was writing a lot of personal stories on my own, novels, short stories that I never tried to publish. I didn't want anybody to read them. I didn't want to be rejected. And once I understood that, then I had to understand, well, why do I have this feeling? And I had to go back and look at this college professor I'd had years before who terrorized me into believing that I couldn't write. That was the mother of the monster. I had to recognize that. Why am I giving this college professor all this power? He's just one person. Mm-hmm. So Grendel is about, going back and going to the mother, kill the monster within you, and then you're going to go for the mother. And, this Beowulf is this ancient tale, this epic. We don't know where it comes from. Actually, it's many theories, and so many of those tales are really they're a form of psychoanalysis. Yeah. So back in the old days, and still in indigenous cultures, I still find this with the Shuar and others in the Amazon, that they tell these stories, and all of these stories, many of these stories, they're really helping you deal with your own psychology. Yeah.
Well, it's all metaphor, isn't it? And we can understand metaphor on a very unconscious level. It speaks to us in ways that perhaps, we couldn't be reached otherwise.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So where does A Gentleman in Moscow come into it, or Moscow, as the Americans say, Amor Towles' book? I mean, that's an interesting one.
Just before we came on, I was looking at this list that I'd sent you and wondering that very question myself. Because it doesn't quite fit with the others so well as this. And I think why I have it on there is because I just recently read it. And I was deeply taken by the writing. Here's a story that if I were to recommend it to you and you say, well, what's it about? Well, it's a guy who spends his life in a hotel. He's under house arrest after the Russian Revolution. And he's a nobleman who's put in this hotel and spends the rest of his life there. Well, that doesn't sound like a very exciting story, now does it? But the way it's written and the way that the author gets us in touch with our own sensuality, the descriptions of food, the descriptions of touch, the descriptions of feelings toward other people, magnificent. And, I think that's something that misses in a lot of writing. It's one of the reasons that I prefer fiction to nonfiction, is because I love the sensual connection, and the sensual. I mean the senses. Yeah. I guess what I really mean is the sensuous. So there's a distinction there between sensuous, which is about the senses, and sensual, which is more sexual. And I'm talking actually sensuous. So it gets us in touch with the sensuous feelings of smell and taste. So, in The Gentleman from Moscow, it really goes into a lot of food stuff. You really can taste it. He's talking about the recipes and just the incredible descriptions of this hotel they're staying in, and the little girl and the older man peering down off this balcony, kind of spying on what people are doing in the lobby, in the dining room. I don't know. I just think it's a brilliantly written book, and I think it differs from the others in its theme in a way, but it's still dealing with a human being struggling within himself, given that he's this wealthy nobleman at one point, and then there's the Russian Revolution, and suddenly he's taken out of this beautiful, luxurious suite that he lived in and put in a little attic apartment. But he uses his imagination. He uses his skills to create this to turn this little tiny apartment into its own world, and he does a magnificent job of it. And he's really having to deal with his own personal struggle of how he overcomes the perception that life has been destroyed. And he could have easily said, "Well, I've been ruined. I've been destroyed." And probably a lot of people would have done that and did do that. But he chooses instead to enjoy the adventure of life. And through this little girl, who then becomes a woman, and through her daughter, he helps create another world, which is a world for them as well as for him.
Yeah, it's an interesting premise, because if you take someone away from all the distractions of life and your world shrinks, then of course you would go deeper into yourself. You know, everything that you have got at your disposal would come to the fore, the senses. You know, you'd notice things around you in a way that you never would otherwise.
Yeah, well, yes. And some people wouldn't. And
some wouldn't.
And they would be destroyed.
Yeah.
So yes, it behooves us to understand that we can do that. Yeah.
So one of your books is Kindred by Octavia Butler, which is the first science fiction written by a Black woman. And I read that it's become a cornerstone of Black American literature, which is an incredible combination of slave memoir, fantasy, and historical fiction. So what was it about that book that you enjoyed so much?
Well, all of the things you just mentioned, plus the fact that it's about a woman in modern times transporting herself back into a previous life. And I'm always fascinated by the idea of past lives and future lives. And of course, the indigenous people I've lived with in the Amazon totally believe in past and future lives. And I think this book is an amazing affirmation of that process. I guess some people wouldn't see it as an affirmation; they might see it as a wild fantasy. But I saw it as an affirmation, and it's brilliantly written, and it so beautifully portrays the aspects of what it was like to have been a slave on these plantations in the United States. And we've, as a young person in high school, I was required to read Gone with the Wind, this classic, and we've realized since that had a very romanticized view of the Southern plantations, and terrible, really, when you think about it. And this book portrays something very differently. And it actually shows the dilemma of the plantation owners too. They were poor. A lot of them were. There wasn't these huge, beautiful Terra type, which is Gone with the Wind. That the plantation's name is Terra, and the balls and the pretty dresses and all this stuff, and the gallantry of the men. None of that's portrayed in this book. Instead, you see a plantation that's struggling to survive, and you realize there were a lot of them like that, and they survived on slavery. And they would have used their slaves sometimes in order to get the work out of them. And it's I think it's totally relevant to modern corporate culture,
yes.
where workers are abused in order for businesses to survive. And of course, the other side of that is the workers realize that if the business doesn't survive, they won't have jobs.
Yeah.
And the slaves are kind of stuck with that too. Like some of them, like, well, why would you run away from the plantation? Where will you go if you run away? What'll happen to you? You can't run away. At least here you've got a roof over your head, and we get some food sometimes. And we're dealing with the same thing all the time. And again, I think that's another theme that runs through so many of these books. You've got Joseph Conrad's The Heart of Darkness, where they're exploiting ivory, killing elephants.
Yes.
Ivory up the Congo River in Africa back in the late 1800s. And, the people doing that, they're doing it because that's what it takes to survive, that the British Empire needs, or whatever the empire is. It could be Dutch, it could be British, it could be French, whatever the empire is, it needs this ivory to survive. And, these plantation owners in Octavia's book is that you see that in them too, that they're stuck in a system that tells them this is what we got to do. Just like I was stuck. I had 50 employees working for me, and it's like, we got to keep doing this stuff in order to keep let all these people continue to have their jobs and feed their families.
Keep the machine going.
Yes, it's quite insidious. It's very insidious.
Yes, it is.
So the question is, how do we break that cycle?
And we must break that cycle.
We must.
Yes. So I'd never heard of this book, John Steinbeck, The Acts of King Arthur and His Noble Knights, his final unfinished work.
Well, King Arthur and the Round Table, that's a fascinating, it's always, I grew up on that story, and I'm just looking at the list now, and I noticed that I don't have on here The Mists of Avalon, which is the woman's version of that story. And which is another book that I love.
Me too.
And I don't know why I could have gone on with 10 more books and then 10 more after that. But so this whole the whole Arthurian tale, and the aspect again that I like of it, and I'm not sure that this comes out of Steinbeck exactly, but it comes through that the Knights of the Round Table, they're sitting around the Round Table, and the Grail appears, and several of the knights jump up to grab it, and it disappears. And Merlin walks into the room, and he says, "Fools! You can't just grab the Grail. You have to go out and earn it." And the knights say, "Well, how do we do that?" And Merlin says, "Well, you've got to go to the darkest place at the edge of the forest, the scariest place you can find at the edge of the forest, and a place where there are no trails. And you've got to go by yourself, then you've got to enter the forest by yourself in the scariest, darkest place where there's no trails. Nobody's gone before you. You've got to go on your own completely. And as you go into the forest, you'll meet monsters." The Grendel.
Touch the Jaguar. Yes.
You'll meet dragons. You'll meet black knights standing on bridges that will want to defy you. You'll meet beautiful maidens who will try to seduce you off your path. But if you confront each of these jaguars as you go into the forest, and you use your heart and your brain, don't pull out your sword. Use your heart and your brain to overcome them. Then eventually you'll reach your Grail. And of course, the Grail is self-awareness, self-consciousness. It's higher consciousness. So I love the Arthurian tales from that standpoint of the quest, the inner quest. Again, it's that mythology of how do we go deeper inside of ourselves to discover who we really are and how we can be better at being who we really want to be.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you mentioned The Mists of Avalon. I mean, it's one of my favorite books, and what I took from that was, which really impacted me, was how much we've lost about our connection with nature.
Yes.
The magic that is in that, gone. Yeah.
And the deep feminine that is within all of us.
Yes.
Nurturing. Yes. Yeah, it should be. Well, that I see. I took these 10 books off a list of about 40, I suppose, or 50. I have. I don't know, and I kind of arbitrarily went through them. I just sort
It's very hard, isn't it?
of.
Yeah. Yeah, lots of people try to sneak. Oh, well, can I have the complete works of? Just to get a few more in there. So the last book on your list is Drums Along the Mohawk by W. Edmonds. That was published in 1936, and it's been a classic ever since.
So I grew up in New Hampshire, and my family goes back to the 1600s in New England. I had a great something grandmother who was captured by the Abenaki Indians, Algonquin-speaking people, and taken off as a captive and became one of them. And I've always been really fascinated by this intersection of when the Europeans arrived, and the people of the Amazon are experiencing something very similar today, which is why I asked for the Amazon when I joined the Peace Corps in 1968, because I wanted to go someplace where this was happening again. And you had this incredible clash of cultures. So you had people who truly believed that they were a part of nature, the indigenous people, the Indians, and Drums Along the Mohawk. And then you had the Europeans, who were really moving more and more toward being apart from nature, taking over nature, destroying nature, cutting the trees. The forest was evil. The Indians must be evil because they lived in the forest. And this incredible clash. And of course, there was this huge seduction for the Indians because suddenly they had their wigwams, their traditional wigwams, but they could put metal stoves in them, wood-burning stoves that made them a lot warmer. And they could, they had warm clothes, and they had flintlock guns that were a lot more effective in many respects than bows and arrows. So it was a very seductive thing for them. And at the same time, it was pulling them further and further away from their connection with nature. And we went through this process, and in that process, we all became further removed from nature. So I find that period, the French and Indian War, what we call the French and Indian War, and then the American Revolution, 20 years later, where these Indians were brought into the conflict and were offered, modern, like in those days, what was modern devices, swords and hatchets and guns. And I've seen the same thing happen in the Amazon, where modern civilization, particularly missionaries and school teachers, go in and offer books, and they offer, well, if you just come around and go to our schools, we'll give you a machete, and a machete is revolutionized, and axes and saws have revolutionized the ways trees are cut. It's very hard to cut a tree with a wooden implement or one with a stone on the end of that as compared to an axe or a machete or a saw. So I've watched something very similarly happen there. But reading Drums Along the Mohawk really helps put this period of time in perspective. That was a time of incredible transformation.
Yeah, I read some time ago about a church in Kentucky that was offering rifles to people, to young men, to come and join the congregation.
Today or back then?
Oh, this was sometime in the last 5 years.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Isn't that outrageous? A church offering guns.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And
Wow.
it's so interesting because the same thing is happening in the West, but instead of guns, we're being given phones and things, mobile phones that make our lives easier, but actually end up controlling us.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. It's the dilemma of changing technologies.
Yes.
The good and the bad that they bring with them.
Yeah. So how, with that in mind, I mean, everything that I've read of yours about the Shuar people is, they're fighting so hard to maintain. I mean, the subtitle of your book is Wisdom from the Last Unconquered People of the Amazon. They're fighting so hard to maintain their way of life and to show us, what we need to remember and to open our hearts. Does technology, is that becoming one of the things that is also becoming a problem for them? How does that play into it?
Yeah, it's a mixed bag, as it always seems to be. So they, they have a huge struggle against petroleum and mining companies now, both American, Canadian, European, and especially today the Chinese are getting bigger there also. And technology helps them to unite against these forces. They can connect with each other through cell phones or shortwave radios or whatever they happen to have, and organize. And they can bring lawyers into this situation and try to hold off these companies legally. At the same time, all of this stuff separates them from nature. And that starts with schools coming in. We think that books are great, that people learning to read. This program is all about. But I've watched from 1968 when I first lived out there. All the little boys would spend their whole day with their dads in the forest learning about the animals. They were hunters, and they were learning, and they were hunters with tremendous compassion for the animals.
Yes.
And they learned that compassion. And the little girls would be with their mothers learning about the plants because they dealt with the plants to eat and for medicinal purposes. And they really learn about the plants. They learn to love the plants and know that in future or past lives, they might be a plant or an animal. And then the schools come in and suddenly they're no longer doing that. Instead, they're sitting in classrooms and the teachers are telling them, well, you don't really need to learn from your mom or dad because it's all in the books. And so there's that separation. And of course, the separation gets bigger as computers come in and cell phones come in and all these things, and they're separating all of us more and more and more from being out in nature. I have a 13-year-old grandson who fortunately does not want to spend a lot of time on his phone. He does, and he's very good in school and he's had to do a lot with computers during the pandemic. But he also is very big on skateboarding and playing lacrosse and going in the woods and getting out into nature. Yeah. But it's a very difficult thing these days. A lot of young people just want to be on these telephones, and parents use that as a babysitter. So, these technologies are constantly moving us further away from nature, but at the same time, they're also giving us the opportunity to understand the science behind nature more. And I think the challenge today, Sandie, is that how do we bring these two together? How do we bring these two worlds together in a real balanced way? And we've recently been, I think, overly balanced toward the scientific, the industrial, the phones, making profits. And now we need to move into rebalance more toward really feeling nature, to being out in it, to feeling that business of being. Again, we get into the difference between apart from versus a part of. And technology increasingly makes us a part from. But let's help it become a part of. I'll give you an example. I love to jog and run in the woods, deep woods. And sometimes, especially as I've gotten older, I trip on a route on the trail. I go on pretty primitive trails. I like them. Sometimes I get off trail and I fall. And my partner, the woman I live with, my soulmate, is like, well, make sure you take your cell phone with you. You don't have to use it. You can turn it off. You don't have to get any calls, but have it with you in case you really get seriously hurt. You can call someone. Yeah. And I've done that. I take it with me and I turn it off. I don't use it, but it gives both of us a greater comfort that if something did happen, I would be able to get help. So, we can look at this as a double-edged sword.
Absolutely, double-edged sword. We've only got a few seconds left, John. Very quickly before we finish, I know that you host life-changing adventures to the mountains and rainforests of Central and South America. What would I need to do to, is it just a matter of signing up? Is it that easy?
Yes. Go to my website, johnperkins.org. And for one thing, register for my newsletter. It comes out once a month, fairly brief. You can put your email and the address in the little box. And then I'll announce the trips. We haven't announced the next set of trips yet, but every year I do a trip to the Mayan people of Guatemala, incredible, Central America, the Kogi of Colombia, and into the Amazon and Andes. And I don't, on my own trips, the Pachamama Alliance is a little different, but on my own trips, I don't do anything to filter out people. And I've been doing this since the late 80s and always have incredibly wonderful groups of people. It's sort of a self-selection process. So yeah, if you sign up, and we'll send you some information that possibly could discourage you from coming if we, but
don't talk about the anacondas.
Oh, anacondas are just beautiful, beautiful. But so yeah, so go on,
Okay.
and within the next month or so, we'll have the next trips listed. They're not yet, but if you sign up for the newsletter, you'll get information about how to get.
Well, I don't know how anybody could read your books and not want to come on one of the trips with you.
Well, they're fantastic. I've been doing this for years and years, and I never get tired of it. It's just, I love doing these. I love the indigenous people. I love the shamans we work with. They're amazing teachers.
So just one sentence of wisdom, what would it be?
Feel blessed to be alive at this time of incredible transformation, and the opportunity for each of us to participate in this very, very important movement away from a death economy to a life economy, to a system that's really going to work for our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. We are all so blessed to be alive right now and participating in this.
And I know that your sequel to The Confessions of an Economic Hitman, you offer a number of strategies that people, if they really want to get involved and make a difference, they'll find some strategies in that book. And also, I think, at dreamchange.org as well.
Yes, correct.
Yeah. John, it's been a pleasure to speak with you. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you for adding your 10 best spiritual books to the No BS Spiritual Book Club's archive.
Well, it's been my pleasure, Sandie. Thank you so much for inviting me. And thank you for all you're doing. I love that you're doing this. It's a beautiful, beautiful theme that you have going here. And thank you so much for all you're doing.
Thank you. Okay, well, that's it for this week. I'm Sandie Sedgbeer, and I'll be back at the same time next week with another 10 Best Spiritual Books interview. Till then, it's goodbye from me.